But the maps that I've looked at show that within just a few weeks, those hot spots don't appear to be remaining, or at least to have subsided enormously.
Yes, of course they are subsided, because everything have, even the nuclear explosion, even though the cavity left by the nuclear explosion will retain hot temperature for some time. This time is limited. Of course, eventually it will cool down.
Let me just mention for the audience, Dimitri, that anyone who would like to look at the kinds of evidence I'm talking about that, in my opinion, tend to undermine the existence of the massive pools of molten metal, they can go to 911scholars.org and scroll down to my Buenos Aires presentation, which is entitled, Was 9/11 an Inside Job? And after you go through about 40 or 50 of the slides, then you'll discover the evidence I'm talking about, but where Dimitri is offering an alternative interpretation of its significance. So, Dimitri, you don't think that the gross difference in the appearance of the demolition of Building 7, where all the floors are coming down at the same time, and that we have this debris pile that's about 5.5 floors, implies a different mechanism of destruction than the Twin Towers, where we have each floor remaining stationary until it's blown apart, and when it's all over, there is no stack of debris of any height, even below ground zero, according to Father Frank Morales. That doesn't suggest to you that different mechanisms were involved?
No, I'm sure that the mechanism was exactly the same, but the difference was about the height of the buildings. So, because as I explained to you, during the underground nuclear explosions, there will be 3 zones: the damaged zone, the crushed zone, and the cavity. So, because of the Twin Towers were too high, they were over 400 meters long, they were not fit in their entirety into the crushed zone alone. So the part of the Twin Towers were represented by crushed zone, and the little part by damaged zone, and also a little part by undamaged zone, which was the very top of the tower, which was the farthest point from the nuclear explosion. That's hence the picture of their collapse. But when it comes to the Building 7, Building 7 was much shorter than that, and its entire length managed to fit into the crushed zone alone. So the Building 7 was pulverized from foundation until the top in its entirety, except the false walls from the ground floor until the 7th floor. That will remain intact because they were not connected to the foundations.
The false walls were a feature of an enormous atrium. Is that what we're talking about? An enormous open lobby? Is that the case?
Yes. Because the Building 7, as I explained, it's how they call it. Its perimeter was the perimeter of the Building 7 was slightly bigger than the foundation of the Building 7. That's why it has a special supporting structure, which was from foundation until the ground 7, until the floor number 7. So the outer walls of the Building 7, which were from the ground level until the 7th floor, they were not structurally connected to the foundations. That's why we can call them false walls. And since they were not connected to the foundation, they were not pulverized by the explosion, by the nuclear explosion. But the rest, everything which was above the 7th floor, including outer walls, was pulverized completely.
This is very interesting. You're aware of the BBC reporter Jane Stanley, who reported that at 4:57 that the building had collapsed, which was, of course, 23 minutes before it would actually take place?
Yes, of course. And by the way, her report was not the first, because I have the original BBC footage. I think that about 6 minutes before her, another BBC reporter reported the same thing. So Jane Stanley was actually the second, not the first.
So what's your take on this? They just got ahead of the script. They knew it was going to happen because it had been planned. And here we have a major news service reporting what they have to have learned from intelligence agencies, I presume. Would that be your take?
I don't think they learn it from the intelligence agency. I think they learn it from probably the Department of Building officials who were responsible for the demolition. Because once they decided to demolish that, they just informed people to get from this area, for safety. And that's probably the news come from that point.
So that destruction had nothing to do with any alleged terrorist attack. That was simply one that was determined by local officials in New York to destroy the building, and it was an opportunistic decision to destroy it for reasons that aren't completely clear.
When it comes to the Building 7, as I told you, that I'm not quite sure about the reasons, but I think they just want to hide the evidence.
Dimitri, this is a perfect time for us to take our second break. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal, with my very special guest today, Dimitri Khalezov, talking about the destruction of the World Trade Center, including the North and the South Towers and Building 7. We'll be right back. Your host on The Real Deal with my very special guest today, Dimitri Khalezov, who was a member of a special unit of the Soviet Army that had to do with nuclear weapons and keeping track of nuclear explosions and all that. He's offering a very interesting alternative take on what happened in New York on September 11th, whereas we have been discussing Building 7, in Dimitri's view, was demolished by means of a nuclear device, and where Dimitri is of the opinion that what I take to be the gross observable differences between the destruction of Building 7 and the Twin Towers does not, in his mind, suggest different mechanisms of demolition, even though it does to me rather strongly. And just to recap, those differences include that in the case of Building 7, all the floors are falling at the same time. Yes, at the rate of free fall, about 6.5 seconds. When it's over, you have a stack of debris about 5.5 floors, equal to about 12% of the height, which is characteristic of classic controlled demolitions based on past experience. But in the Twin Towers, we have these buildings that are more than twice as tall at 110 floors. They're also coming down at the rate of free fall. Officially, I think the South Tower is rated at 9 seconds and the North Tower at 11, or approximately 10 seconds apiece. We're going to talk extensively about the Twin Towers now, but where you have each floor remaining stationary, waiting its turn to be blown to kingdom come, in the memorable words of Morgan Reynolds. And when it's all done, there's no stack of debris, and as I've mentioned, Father Frank Morales, who was there at the time, has reported that they were actually destroyed below ground level. Now, Dimitri, going to the North and the South Tower, if the nuclear explosion is in the basement, then why are the buildings, as it were, turning to dust from the top down?
Okay, first of all, I would like to correct that the nuclear explosions were not at the basement, they were much below the basement. So let's say the basement of the Twin Towers was like 27 meters below the ground level.
Okay.
But the nuclear explosions took place 50 meters below the lowest foundation. So it means it was 77 meters from the ground level.
That's just astounding. That is just astounding to me. So the very first thing that had to be done in the construction of these buildings was in placing these nuclear devices well below the basements of the buildings. That had to have been the very first thing to have been done. In other words, arranging for the demolition before the buildings were even erected.
Yes, it looks like this. Because I'm not quite sure what they did first. They started the construction, or they put the nuclear charge, but because I was not a witness of that.
Sure.
But what I know, that the nuclear charges were positioned 50 meters below the lowest underground level of the Twin Tower.
Yeah.
77 meters from the ground surface.
Yes. Now, how could it be the case that the nuclear charges were so deeply even below the sub-basements, and yet the buildings are being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust from the top down?
Okay, I will try to explain it. So you see, let's imagine that we have the nuclear charge positioned 77 meters below the ground, and the foundation of the tower is 27 meters below the ground. So it means from the foundation until the nuclear charge is 50 meters now. So when the nuclear charge is exploding, it will begin to evaporate rock around itself by hitting the rock.
Right.
Okay, so eventually it will create a cavity.
Yes, and there's a layer of crushed rock, crushed rock the size of a human hair, and then the other layers. Yes, go ahead.